Hi there, I'm Ian Warner, and this is another episode of A Friendly Chat About. This is the second of the weird and wonderful settings, fantasy courtesans. I will just turn to it in the book. Fantasy courtesans. The granddaddy of role-playing games is Dungeons and Dragons. There's no getting away from that. It was pretty much the first to sort of define itself as a role-playing game. And having a good go at Dungeons and Dragons has been done to death. There's lots and lots of different parodies on it, and to be frank, it's parodied itself at times. I'm looking at you, Spelljammer. But really, I thought you couldn't really do an alternate settings book without a fantasy variant. And I came up with Fantasy Courtesans. It's somewhere in the middle ground between high and low fantasy. And yeah, it's one of these games that you're thinking, why is this system being used for fantasy? I suppose the whole thing's really a joke, but I think it can work. And even later on, when I developed Transported and the rules for playing games of the History Pass series divorced from the strict structures, I think Fantasy Courtesans will be a reasonable sort of dungeon basher in itself. But that's for the future. Let's have a look at the system. The inspirations first. Inspirations. Now, as I said, granddaddy of all role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons. So, anytime you do fantasy role-playing, there's going to be some crossover with Dungeons and Dragons. The thing is, I haven't played much of it. It might seem unusual, but I didn't get into role-playing through Dungeons and Dragons. That was Paranoia and New World of Darkness. So I don't know. I've only played one game of 3.5 and a campaign of 4th edition. They were both taking the piss. So really, I don't know that much about Dungeons and Dragons. What I do know is the fantasy setting I set up for WizKid, which has some influence from what I encountered in that 4th edition game. As well as some folklore, and I think my orcs and my goblins are very inspired by the Games Workshop, the Warhammer world versions of those. Orcs are big green brutish hulks, and goblins are little green tricksy things. So that was that was the central inspiration for those two races. Dwarves all having beards. I thought that was funny. So yes, even though this is Fantasy Courtesans, you're playing a female character, you've got a beard, bitch. Yeah, that's how this game rolls. It's supposed to be silly. Anyway, so those are the central. The Steamia and the sample setting, I kind of made it kind of a sort of a Yorkshire Moorly type, Northern England, pseudo-medieval setting, and change that slightly when it comes around to the fantasy versions of Justice. I might actually set that in a completely different world, but we'll have to see. Anyway, so central inspirations are from the Warhammer world, bits of Dungeons and Dragons, and the original folklore. I maintain calling nymphs Selkies because I find it funnier that they're all Scottish and bad-tempered. Not that I have anything against the Scottish, but it's just funny having these the sort of nymphs, and you give them the very sort of harsh accent of Scotland. I'm not saying the Scottish accent can't be sexy. I mean, look at Karen Gillan, but you give them this very sort of harsh accent that you don't normally associate with that, and it's a good laugh. Anyhow, on to the system. System. Now, what I didn't want to do was hack up the existing structure and basically write a dungeon crawler. Clearly, you can use these rules with a bit of improvising as a dungeon crawler, but I wanted to keep it as a Courtesans game for this setting. So the structure's still there. The classes, which are replacement for origins, are themed around what use they would be to a courtesan. So although you've got your typical sort of fantasy game classes, you've got your barbarians, your bards, your clerics, diplomats. I wasn't sure about diplomats. You do get some kind of diplomatic classes in things like Dungeons and Dragons and its various spin-offs, but they're kind of a cross between that and sort of a ninja class as well, which is rather interesting. Nobles, yes, that's an uncommon class again. And you've got your sorceresses, your typical mage. Finally, you've got a wench. Wench is basically your rogue. As I said, theme all around the courtesan lifestyle, and they all have an extra resource called magic. And magic can be invested like any other resource, but just like vampire blood, it can be used on superpowers. And each class has its own magic power, which in some cases, like the barbarian's case, it may not exactly be magic in the strictest sense, but I just called it magic overall just to just to have some consistency. Yeah, so the big innovation, of course, with fantasy courtesans was the introduction of what will become grim and gritty combat. There are differences in fantasy courtesans to what we ended up with in Doxy, in that poison. I think the poison rules in here are a bit overcomplicated. It's a personal preference. I simplified them in Doxy. You don't have to, but I personally do. So that's my take on it. But yeah, combat is, I think it's quite, I wouldn't say unique, but it's interesting in that it's a system whereby you both make your attack at the same time. It's each round of combat is a roll-off, and from this roll-off, you determine who's broken through whose defences, and weapons with defensive bonuses are good at parrying, and those with offensive bonuses are good at hitting the target. Those with rending bonuses take all the defensive bonuses, and so on. It's all it's a pretty sound combat system and uses the statistic decay mechanics that I underused in Courtesans as a damage track. whilst this gets a lot more brutal in Doxy, as you probably know if you've seen that episode with firearms, but being a medieval setting, there are no firearms, so that's sorted. Yeah, so that's the system. It's I think it's relatively sound for what it's intended for. If there is demand for expanding it into a proper dungeon crawler, just let me know. I will make that move, and yeah, we may see Courtesans dungeon crawler. So that's Fantasy Courtesans. Interesting little setting. Whether you use a Steamia or a setting of your own, it's full of variations on the rules you can use in other variants of the game. I never play any game, even when I've written rules as written. I'm always coming up with new ways to hack the system and I encourage you to do the same. Fantasy Courtesans is it's special in that it is the first game to use what will become the Grim and Gritty combat system. But as I've said, it may need a bit of tweaking to make it quite as balanced as it is in later versions. That's your fantasy setting. I shall be going on to do the science fiction setting and its shameless rip-off of Warhammer 40,000. I hope you can join me for that.